Welcome, dear guests of Geopolitical Dialogues in Ukraine Crisis Media Center. Today, the 1st of October, and it is an important day in history of Ukraine, Ukrainian Cossacks, Intercession Day. But the main thing for us is that this is a day of defenders of Ukraine. Since the war is ongoing, I think when talking about our heroes, may God bless their lives, we have to remember all those who gave their lives for Ukraine. And so I would like to ask Pavlo Klimkin and everyone in this room to think about it in a moment of silence. Today's geopolitical dialogues unfortunately continue during the war, and perhaps this story will be very long. But the situation is changing, and in order to react correctly to the enemy's actions, in order to find a winning solution in different ways, of course, we have to assess where we are now. What should we do next in such cynical, such harsh external environment which is constantly changing? Unfortunately, lately we see only reactions to some daily statements, whether from Donald Trump or other politicians, and this informational realm or such a new informational component sometimes creates emotional swings for Ukrainians, for our fellow citizens, and some degree of uncertainty in solutions from our partners. Therefore, in my opinion, we have to have a sober vision. Talking from the perspective of not emotions but the arguments, and we have to assess the situation, and this conversation is therefore very important. And indeed, it was necessary, it was important for us to have a guest who can assess not only tactical moments but also consider the strategical development of the situation. And we would like to thank Pavlo Klimkin because he agreed to share his thoughts with us. And I guess there is no sense to introduce him. The Minister of the Foreign Affairs of Ukraine back in 2014-2019, and ambassador to many different countries. But the most important thing for me now is that Pavlo Klimkin is constantly involved in the discussion of such strategic topics, and through research work in Carnegie Center for Peace in Washington, and also through the other projects in which he gets the feedback from our partners, Americans and Europeans. And therefore, it is also very interesting to hear about it and your impression of the external assessment. So the first question is probably traditional. I'm not going to ask you when the war will be over, because quite obvious that it is the most important question for everyone. But I have a similar question, but in a broader context. Many people say, but quite a quite a few people are discussing that the war has changed. It started as Russian war in Ukraine and now it is changing into something else. Some people say that it's now European war. The others say that it's more kind of global dimension, and now Beijing, Washington, Brussels, and Kyiv cannot resolve this issue easily. What do you think? Where are we now? It's Speaking of this war, which started back in 2014 and then full-scale invasion back in 2022, and where are we now in this war? Well, first of all, thank you for the idea to meet today. This is a very important day in the history of Ukraine, and lots of events happened on this day, very important events for Ukraine. And I always appreciate this opportunity to have this dialogue, because it is a dialogue. That is how this program is called. Today, the war, I do not know whether there is a specific point in it, but nevertheless, it's about geopolitics. For many, Ukraine is not critical or critically important, but our war exists. And even for those who are geographically, sometimes politically or economically quite far, and whose key interest is there is such a thing in geopolitics, which is called key interest, when a country or group of countries start responding by involving all the resources they have as a rule, and that is according to the definition, and whose key interests did not previously cover Ukraine. Firstly, I believe that the Russian leadership lost dynamics when time, as they believed, worked for them. And this opinion is now shared by many, both among Western politicians and experts and non-Westerners. This means that the situation on the battlefield, even after some serious changes, will not give the Russian Federation some cardinal advantages. The second thing is that when Donald Trump really wanted to have a deal, the deal is almost conceptual thing. It could have been done on a better terms. And this largely a personally story for Donald Trump, who makes all the key decisions in the current administration. When he doesn't make progress, he starts to build possible strategies. What will be the best in the long run? And it becomes the matter of principles for him to get advantage, to prevail. The third question is that Americans, but many others as well, and these assessments are shared by many actors. Well, they saw not just decline of Russian economy, but they saw that it's a sustainable decline of economy. So all those investments in overheated economy, which they had in the beginning and which gave the real growth, for example, 4.3% in 2024, they are declining, and there are no simple ways without sacrificing something to keep economy stable do not exist. And this is either an increase in debt or a gain with ruble exchange rate. Both has a price, and both most likely will not save Russia from deflation, which will not occur there within the next several months, but most likely will be a reality of 2026. This means that nowadays Russian economy reality is already facing the issues with the intensivity of both hostilities and financing of internal programs. If we consider the financing of the national project, we can see that everything related to technologies, well, for example, digital or space technologies, they are either fundamentally underfunded or are almost not funded at all. So this current situation affects technological decline of the Russian Federation, and it is written a lot about. In 8 months, we have a decline of oil and gas revenues by 20.2%. Well, you can play with statistics, but more or less 1/5. And if we are talking about fundamental priorities for today's American administration, and they will stick to the next year's elections, this will be the oil price. The agreement that oil prices should not increase significantly, well, that is one of a few stable variables in today's global economy. And all of it together means that if for the American administration of Donald Trump, he has some time, and I think it will be important for him to show the result till the midterm elections. He clearly understands that time works for him. I mean, the possibility to talk to the Russian leadership. But at the same time, for grappling this logic, so whether time works for them or against them, it has changed. And it's not something that only me saying, but many others, the other experts share the same opinion. This also does not mean that everything will change immediately and quickly, because speaking of ideology, the current Russian reality is not ready to make the decision which historically, ideologically, and politically, I think in this very order, will be perceived as the absence of even minimum victory or something that can be constructed mythologically as a victory. And this concerns both the territories and other results. And the last thing I would like to say is that this war, of course, is about us. This war is about the European security, but it is also about how can key players agree or not agree. And many things depend on what kind of agreement, how it will be documented, whether there will be any kind of guarantees, or maybe there will be only like personal obligations, whether it will have some kind of impact on the other, in particular, economical agreements. Everyone consider it as the first pilot case of the 20th century. So this will probably work many, many years later. And for many, that means where we are now. And that this possibility is something we shouldn't miss. In my opinion, the American administration, at least from the insights I have, they understand it much better than they did it 3-4 months ago. There is some kind of consensus opinion. It's hard for me to say, but nevertheless, there is an understanding that Americans can use it for themselves, for their own gains and interests. It finally appeared, and therefore we have this new trend, and we have to use it for our own benefits. Thank you. I can confirm your words with some examples, but in my opinion, they are still quite controversial. For example, delay allocation of purchased weapons for 1.5 months by Pentagon. This weapon is gone. It is finally in Ukraine, and that's good. But it is concerning that in the new document for the National Defense Strategy, emphasis is made in the Western Hemisphere, and there is a focus on the internal affairs, and I can say that we cannot say that there is a real shift. We can say that it's that the understanding is coming soon, but we have to be creative. And speaking of the statements we heard in recent days, and what is even more interesting, it appeared in Western media, and the key phrase that appeared there is that Ukraine can win, and that is an important informational narrative, because until recently many countries were stating that Ukraine cannot win. For example, Mr. President Orban, he said that Ukraine has no chance, and then suddenly the US president says it, and yesterday the American Secretary of War has repeated the same, and we just have to wait for the next steps. And then I have the question, maybe you will be able to answer it briefly, even though it is difficult. We are asking the Europeans to cover some gaps, to impose secondary sanctions against a shadow oil fleet of the Russian Federation. That is what you mentioned, 20% decrease, but mainly it happened thanks to the Ukrainian defense forces and, well, partially sanctions, of course, but the gaps are still there. And in the situation when Ukraine is asking to cover these gaps, I mean the funds for the war, for oil experts, why doesn't the Ukrainian government dare, even though when you were the minister, we were winning the course in more difficult conditions with the Russians, so with Gazprom, why they do not dare to cut off the supply, oil transit through Ukraine? Why we, in fact, finance the war by fulfilling the contract? We, in fact, continue to finance Russian capabilities. Explanation by President of Ukraine Volodymyr Zelensky said that if there will be the breach of contract, we will fail in the court. So therefore we have two questions: whether it is a really good option to stop the oil transit, and second, is this really without option that we will lose in court? Well, there are two aspects. One of them is political, and it is quite obvious, because this oil, it goes to Central Europe. Part of the refining stations in Central Europe, and that is not only Hungarians, still work with Russian mixes. Let's clarify. You said Central Europe. As far as I understand, Czechs refused. Czechs found an alternative, right? Yes. Then Hungary and Slovakia, there are two countries. Actually, this is not the central. Yes, but Russian mixtures entering the markets in Hungary and Slovakia, they lead to the redistribution of how the refineries can work. So the business model, in fact, affects not only Hungary and Slovakia. Do you understand what I mean? I understand that they make money from this. Yes, everyone understands that in India, in fact, we have a massive processing of Russian oil, and this is one of the options for Russian oil to continue getting on the world market. In my opinion, that is a sad example on how we maintain oil balance. And as for Central Europe, the situation is less well known there. In my opinion, there is once again a political component. I mean, the influence of both Hungary and Slovakia on European decision making, because they can enter the stage of complete blockade of these decisions if oil doesn't get in. And I think that such blackmail, it is not public and it already exists. Having a complete blockade of two countries or of those who are indirectly supporting them, it's a very complicated thing. And when we point our fingers at Viktor Orban, it doesn't mean that he alone in the European Union has problems with our cooperation with the European Union. Quite obviously, we understand that there are those who are covering Orban or Fitz, and at the moment they just do not know what to do next. So they do not know how to build the process of our further entry into the European Union. He has never had any issues with preliminary process for a country that for the state and war, especially the war with a nuclear country. And it is obvious that this process cannot be built on old patterns. I will say it very softly, old ones. Because there are no new ones. So here we are dealing with some political stakes. And as for legal matters, yes, this is a complicated thing. And I clearly remember those trials which we had in London regarding a famous loan that was granted to the Russian leadership and received by so-called three. And then we succeeded to prove that these all happened by force and achieve full consideration of the case. It is a very difficult story. Commercial contracts are typically considered by courts in a very such a limited, restrictive interpretation. Are we able to win this case by referring to the force majeure conditions and war? Well, that is something we have to analyze together with the lawyers, but I believe that there is no 100% guarantee of success. Knowing other similar considerations in courts, but once again, political aspect is still there. And again, in today's reality, Orban maintains ties with the American administration and personally with Trump. And even the day before elections in Hungary, he still remains a player in European politics. And separating him and isolating him in European politics is something that everyone failed to do. And therefore, when considering this issue, I wouldn't have focused only on legal aspect. There is lots of political matter, both public and non-public politics, and sometimes we all have to make difficult decisions in order for more important issues not to be blocked or delayed, so that they wouldn't be delayed when we need it. And this is an important thing. And now I would like to say another thing regarding European sanctions. So, did I understand you correctly that raising this question is something we shouldn't do? No, we should. So we need to raise this question. We have to raise the question of stopping the transit. Yes, but first we have to understand whether we are going to obtain European support and some solution inside the European Union, and how can we nivellate all the political risk, or we choose a legal path. There is no understanding whether we move only on the right or only on the left, and without understanding of all political risks, in fact, it is impossible to build a good strategy for this case. Well, now you have presented how our official structures work, they have approximately the same thoughts. And I can say that you can ask ordinary Ukrainians, what is more important, steps towards European integration or victory in the war? And all of them, they say that victory in the war. How can we be asking Europeans to use Russian money when Christine Lagarde says that will reduce euro renminbi, or the Bulgarian, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, says that we cannot unfreeze this money more than 230 billion because in this case there will be no trust to our bank system. So here we have a very complicated issue. Do we understand that this war can escalate into a European war, and then we'll forget about all of these questions, and finally we will be trying to stop the war in Europe, and Ukraine, which is the most interested in this, is now asking the questions. Well, they are thinking about post-war period. Yes, they are important, they are strategical, the membership in the European Union, but nevertheless it might not happen if now we do not accept the political position. And now you're saying, like, how Europe will help us. It is quite easy. We know that there is that one country cannot block the decision. If there are two of them, it is difficult. But Ukraine proposed to both Slovaks and Hungarians. And by the way, there is a dialogue with Slovaks to restructurize, to revive the contract. We suggested other ways, meaning that if these countries strictly block political decision, then we won't be able to change their position without Brussels. And do you think that Brussels doesn't have the leverage over Slovakia? Do you think that Brussels doesn't have money and funds? I agree with you. This is a complex question, but for the third year, we're discussing this matter, and no shift, no changes. And then the next day, to the elections in Hungary. It seems to me that the fourth year of war, and you're saying that we have to calculate, to discuss, and what were we doing before? That is not a question. That is my reaction to the fact that we still ask lots of questions and we prioritize them over the war. But that is the opinion of most of politicians around the world, and everyone thinks of the future. And therefore, I interrupted you when you were talking about sanctions. So speaking of the sanctions, how can we cheer up the European partners to give us the money and to unfreeze Russian assets? Because quite obviously they should compensate at least those losses that Ukraine is getting right now. Well, let me return to Hungarians and Slovaks. The problem is not what they are going to do or what they are not going to do in the context of European integration. The problem is whether they support, and in the near future will support decisions made by the European Union, which are critical for our financing. Because the war cannot be won if we do not remain steadiness of both our society and support for the army, and money is basically coming from Europe. And now when Americans in fact stopped financing, it means that the money we are using is mostly European. This is also something that is done in the framework of European programs. This is also something we've mentioned, frozen assets. Now a number of options are discussed, including the credit for frozen assets, but the logics of European decision is basically based on the consensus rule. So all the key decisions, no matter how much we discuss it about when we are talking about the rule of majority, qualified majority, and so on, all decisions are made by consensus. All sanctions packages are done by consensus. For example, if Slovaks and Hungarians are stuck and not moving forward, that means that the fundamentally important things for our financing and for the pressure in the result are not implemented. Does Brussels have leverage over the Hungarians and Slovaks? Yes, of course, Brussels has it. But as of today, Orban did not make any steps forward, even despite the fact that he does not receive part of the money. And the European Union is discussing the application of Russia came out of it, and US was not interested in it as well. So Ukraine has to take into account now that all these restrictions which existed before and the mechanism of control, they are changing, and therefore we have to be looking, in my opinion, we have to be looking for the niche and establishing the joint shield, European shield, and even nuclear shield, because we are not covered just as well as Europeans aren't. Well, speaking of the anti-missile, we are looking for it, and as for nuclear, well, nuclear, I mean that these things are interrelated. If there are nuclear states in Europe, I mean Great Britain and France, then the initiative of the French President Macron, he is making the initiative and then he is pulling back, and we have to discuss it, whether there is the shield or not, or maybe the Americans will provide us nuclear umbrella, and then we will have to rely on the Americans, and therefore two submarines with strategic missiles are somewhere there. So it's not serious. Europe has to be thinking about themselves. What can Ukraine suggest in this case? So that is a joint work in the system of the missile defense, but that is a separate topic. We had very interesting questions. We have discussed a lot, and me as moderator, I have to be concluding this discussion, and maybe at least one question from the audience, please. Could you introduce yourself, please? Petro Kanana, military diplomat of the Ukrainian mission to NATO, Colonel of the General Staff, veteran of the Ukrainian Armed Forces of Ukraine. First of all, thank you very much for the interesting dialogue. And second of all, in the context of Valeriy Chaly's words about the cuts of the modern executive branch money for informing the publics in the field of the European Euro-Atlantic integration, I would like to remind the Borden authorities that for more than 20 years in the NATO documents, Ukraine is listed as a keystone of the Euro-Atlantic security. And now two quick questions. Mr. Pavlo Klimkin, as a former representative of the former executive authorities, have you heard from your American colleagues or from someone from the modern executive, from the current executive branch, at least some reaction to the above mentioned statements of Viktor Orban, and regarding the end of the war of nuclear state Russian Federation against non-nuclear state Ukraine, and the end parallels between the end of the war of the nuclear USSR against non-nuclear state Afghanistan, so that they can find a general from a courageous face with a courageous face, and for him to withdraw the troops and to look at the territory of Ukraine. Thank you very much for the question. I hear a lot from our friends about the fact that on the one hand it doesn't look like the Afghanistan case and it is absolutely different history, but on the other way, strategic exhaustion of the Russian Federation, and not only from the economical perspective but also technological stagnation, and that is a fact. National Russian projects related, first of all, to technologies are definitely not financed as a priority. In the projects where USSR had leadership, and even Russia had leadership back in the early 90s, the decline starts there. Well, look at the pump, which works in the national space industry, and what they are doing in space, and it's almost nothing compared to the previous projects, and compared to their ambitions is nothing. And that means that this exhaustion is real. It will work with some certain time lag. I mean, it is postponed, and at the moment, I can see anyone who would like to help Russia with key technologies that are on the verge in the Russian Federation. So Chinese will give only the bare minimum, but they are not going to give them the best what they have. And the same thing regarding the other things. Well, does this mean that the situation will be the same with the Russian Federation as it used to be with USSR and Afghanistan? Well, obviously not. But nevertheless, all these ideas about the attempts to get into some realities which are not about the Russian Federation, well, historically they ended up badly, and in this sense there are definitely some certain parallels, and lots of different articles and monographs were written about it, and everything is very complicated. But nevertheless, the game with these comparisons is always there. Is it there on the political level? No. Is it present on the level of the experts? Well, yes. Orban's statement. Oh, Orban. Well, in fact, I see rejection at the level of journalists, at the level of experts, but in my opinion, that is a right reaction. If we start actively commenting on Orban, it means that we will draw more attention to his statements, and then commenting on Orban will become the mainstream of the current politics. And Trump, he communicates quite regularly with Orban, and if he wanted, he would have written a post about him, but he's not doing that. And if you consider even the people from Trump's circles, they are in touch with Budapest. They could have written something, but they are not commenting on anything either. And in my opinion, that is the best comment. Well, thank you. And concluding our conversation, if possible, briefly, the war. We started with this. Can we call this war European war? Or it's too early? Or will it continue? So you understand why I'm talking about it, because in fact there is the violation of the airspace. Is it Russian war in Ukraine, or is it European? And maybe forecast is something ungrateful, but will Putin continue to develop escalation in terms of direction of the countries of Europe, not on the EU? I think Europe, neither as a whole nor as some separate countries, so they did not decide where they are, on which side they are. Recently, I heard the statement by the German defense minister Boris Pistorius that we are not the party of the side of this war, but we cannot say that we are in a peaceful situation. So the recognition of this hybrid reality exists, and it exists, and we've heard similar statements from Warsaw. And in my opinion, these provocations, in fact, they contribute to this vision in Europe, because they are about several things. They are about testing of the reaction time, testing of reaction options. They are about the effort to shake up today's Europe and to show that Europe is not capable of something. But as usually, it could turn out differently, and Europe might decide that it's a good time for new abilities, and it's a new opportunity to make a new step. And Americans perceive Europe in a different way, and I think that Europe has these chances. And if not, then I think that despite all the political problems, Europe might have the new coalitions of that are willing to create something greater than what they have now. So they can divide into smaller ones, creating greater unity. Well, it doesn't mean that it will be more than it is now, but sometimes it is even more. And therefore, despite despite of lack of consensus in Europe, there is still a movement in order to move forward, and I can see these opportunities for them. And if the autonomous Crimea contributes to that, why not? Of course, the only thing I can add is that, in my opinion, it's not the provocation. Provocations happened a long time ago, and now it is a special operation. And in my opinion, it is planned. I cannot say that it's planned from the strategical perspective, but there will be escalation, and Putin will kind of they will do it just for internal use. So they will be selling this story that they are fighting against Europe, and it will be hard for the Russians to comprehend this great mission. Well, it will not work. It would have worked a few years. In Russia, maybe it works. In Russia, it works internally. And in my opinion, Putin will not avoid this attempt of intrusion to some European country on the land. Let's see what he will come out of, but I'm quite confident that there will be a kind of hybrid attempt. Let's see what will happen. Thank you very much for this conversation. It is not pessimistic or optimistic. It is about being real. And we have to be distinguishing informational statements, pictures, and many other things. We were talking about it. There are some certain technologies when politicians want to draw more attention to themselves, and sometimes there is some meaning behind it, and sometimes not. And when we're talking about Donald Trump, that is political technology, and there was the political technologist who suggested to come up with the events. Steve Miller is in charge of this group, and they continue doing so. And as for the facts show that in my opinion, European war is not stopping, it's ongoing, and it is European, because today we were saying that there is a factor of many other players, not only Russia and Ukraine, even though, of course, Russia would have stopped, and I think that Putin at the moment, he cannot stop this war with his voice, but that is a global character of this war. Anyways, we state that Ukraine, in conditions of such constant indecisiveness, uncertainty, we are in this situation for the fourth year, and we are holding our positions. And I can see even more parallels with Afghanistan that Mr. Pavlo, in the sense that, well, it's not a partisan war, and there were different situations, and among the heads were operating in the depths of the USSR. But from the perspective of the exhaustion and the reason, well, the idea was in fact quite clear to cover the southern flank of the USSR from some certain risks. I can accept this idea, and after that there was an aggression, the act of aggression. The USSR has had an aggression against the independent state, and after you got more and more understanding of why was that done and why economy was counted plus the victims, and it's not it was just 15,000 people. No, that was what we heard, but in my opinion that were millions of people who were wounded and killed. And then, well, we found some decision was found, and when it was found, when one leader has replaced another, and I think that in our case, that is something we like. Well, Mr. Valeriy, let me say that I see the development of the last 3 plus or minus months as realistically positive. Definitely not in a negative way. speaking of many things which we were discussing today and many things which we didn't discuss, I can see that there is something that goes for us like this. Whether it will be stable, sustainable for us, well, that is a question that once again depends on many factors. Nevertheless, the real reasons for pessimism, right, like let's say from June, I don't see them. That is great. We will see next month what Ukraine will receive in terms of weapons, which decisions in Europe will be made regarding sanctions, and the third thing that is what is positive, that is the the narratives change. That suddenly they started believing Ukraine's victory. It would have been bad if it was just the way to push us to the long war. And if there is a desire to help Ukraine to shorten these terms to get victory sooner, I'm of course supporting this fully, but we will see that soon. Thank you, Mr. Pavlo Klimkin, for your optimism, for explanation. And typically there are no simple questions. I couldn't get any kind of simple answers from you. All of your answers were very diplomatic. Thank you very much for everyone who watched us. And nevertheless, the positions which were expressed today, they are absolutely clear, understandable for our partners as well. So let's stay optimistic, but let's realistically assess what needs to be done today without putting it off for some years to come. Thank you for the participation, and thank you for the dialogue, and thank you for those who were asking the questions. Article 3 of the Treaty of the European Union, when the voting possibility can be taken away from the country, and I think that there is no political will among the members of the European Union at the moment, and therefore, of course, we can believe our emotions, and as each and every Ukrainian, I cannot live without emotions, but I understand perfectly well that interrupting now the decision financing our budget about weapons, about something else, when the leadership of Hungary or Slovakian and Hungarian leadership, and I would like to emphasize it when they are acting in someone's interest. So, and therefore, preserving oil transit is blowing up my brain. On the 4th year of the full-scale war and 11th year of the war, but when making this decision, we need to make it only when we clearly understand that in the European Union there is a political will to eliminate key negative consequences for us, and not only political will but also ways to implement it. And as of today, none of it exists, and we have to be honest with ourselves about it. And as for the rest of the sanctions, I do not see the opportunities for the European Union to efficiently implement the sanctions without interaction with the states. Even speaking of the shadow fleet, there is some certain progress, because at the moment many countries of non-Western world either restricted or stopped accepting oil from the shadow economy fleet, and we can see that both in China and in many other countries. And that means that when there is coordination between states and the European Union and of course the other players, for example Japanese, Canadians and others, it works much better. Unfortunately, desire to close the loopholes for circumventing sanctions, and most importantly the political will to implement it, it appeared not on the first and not even on the second year of the war. Partially it is due to the absence of relevant practices and experience in the European Union. Only now, on the third fourth year of the war, many European countries create special sanctions enforcement units. Simply, they didn't have it before because they have never done anything like that. And the depths of these issues, because you can always go to court to strike sanctions, it should be on the level which Europe has never seen before. And therefore, for me, the opportunity for the Europeans and Americans to interact, which in fact exists now, even though it is not on the level we would like to see it, it is still the possibility to restrain all the ways to be buying and selling everything. And I can illustrate it with one simple example. Things happening in the refining market of the Russian Federation, that is the result of the systematic crisis, because they have the equipment which is older than 25 years, and our ability to make very well coordinated and effective strikes. But also, it is also the result of sanctions, because despite all the efforts, the Russian Federation reached only 45% of localization for the equipment for oil refining, and they actually had more ambitious target, and we know it. And under the sanctions, bringing this equipment even from the countries which actually have trade relations with the Russian Federation, it's still very difficult. So sanctions in this sense are actually working, and what we see now is in fact direct and in some way indirect work. The problem is that sanctions work, first of all, not that fast as we would like it to be, and it's rather a medium-term work. And only now, after 3+ years, some of the sanctions imposed back in 2022 start to become a noose around the neck of the Russian Federation. So almost no sanctions work the next day. And the second thing is that learning how to overcome the bypass paths and to allocate the special services and also in particular the Ministry of Finance and the Ministry of Justice. And for the US it was more or less okay, and they had similar experience. And if we're talking about Europe, they never had such experience. And if Europe will learn to do that, we can say that we have much better chances. Well, this is something I can hear from many Europeans as well, and I have the question, quite simple and rhetorical. If we, during the war, during large-scale war, we will be thinking years and decades ahead, then the war will never be over. Speaking of the sanctions implementation, you know that UN charters say it really easily that there is an embargo and the sanctions are being imposed automatically and quickly. For example, SWIFT disconnection. This is not a year. The thing is that it was introduced like that. It is not about how sanctions work. Yes, for some it will take years, and some of them accumulate, and then you have secondary sanctions, but some of them are very simple. For example, embargo is a simple thing, and it worked really well. The thing is that Russia has blocked it. And then if we consider the situation without emotions, in this case, we can be observing it for years. And I can say that sometimes emotions are needed. There was the story when Churchill came to Roosevelt. I know that you know this story, but let me remind you. When he had to involve Americans and he just refused to go to Blair House, and he went to the White House, and then he spent some time with the US president, and he got some 50 vessels. But arguments without emotions. Ukraine now, you know, it can turn into a very long story. And therefore, I believe that we should not be looking only down. We have to look up. And for example, we have Hungary. That is just my opinion. So, Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of Hungary claims that in Ukraine we have the political coup, and Ukraine has to give up on the territories because Hungary gave up the territories and they deliberately stopped the war, and Ukraine has to do the same. And the Prime Minister says, you lost, and then they launch reconnaissance on our territory. Their tanks, and that is fact. The Hungarians confirmed that they have sent motorized infantry units before 22nd of February 2022. Why did they do that? Because they were explaining to Brussels and NATO that that is the way how we were expecting the refugees with motorized infantry units. So this is not a very friendly country, and Hungary said that they are going to block everything. So why we are adjusting? We are adjusting to the compromises stated by the other state. I think that is a weak position. I think that we have to make a step forward. We have the leverages over Hungary. There was a meeting with Prime Minister Fitz. The president met him and the Prime Minister were there, and some solutions are found there. So with Hungary, we have nothing, and observing the situation, supplying them oil because they are threatening to block something or not allowing us to enter the EU. Are we the country that is the very last in Europe that we are going just to watch, to observe this non-European position, because it contradicts the common external defense and defensive position of the European Union? This is a Maastricht Treaty. We perform some foreign policy solutions even much better than Hungary does it for Brussels, and therefore it's not just emotions. In my opinion, we have to make steps. During the war, we cannot create the problems even on the other border, but Hungarians do that already. So we have to find the formula. And recently, I do not see any kind of ideas, any kind of attempts to show our impact. So at the moment, we can have a difficult situation with Poland because some conversations are starting there. Luckily, on the Romanian side, Moldova gave us good news because they are reliable partners. So let's discuss reliable partners in Europe. So the situation which is making us more optimistic that are elections in Moldova. So I'm not going to ask you about the elections. So we understand that, of course, it is interesting to hear what you think about these perspectives. But then we have the question, it's both simple and difficult. How it is better to have negotiations with Moldova or without? So it was very relevant before the elections, but I would like to ask you this question now when finally the situation is over. So should we go in the same package or in different ones? I do not have that much optimism. In fact, elections are over and ruling party won, and it doesn't mean that Russia will not change its strategy on destabilization of Moldova. I think that Moldova itself is not so critical as we are, because we are very important for the Russian mythology and ideology, but in Moldova they have enough leverages. Some time ago it was quite clear that ruling party will win this election. Well, actually, the polls show that, well, you had such confidence, but not everyone was so confident. Yes, I had it. I cannot say that I had it for a long time, but I had it for some time. I guess you met someone in Europe. Yes, I can say that I have something to do with what's happening around Moldova, and for us, that is also the challenge for our security, and it is related not only to Transnistria but also with Russian contingent and also with the other matters. According to OCVs, despite elections, a significant part of Moldova's citizens, I cannot say that they are pro-Russian, but they are Russia-oriented. They consume lots of information, and even though Russian channels number of Russian channels is decreasing, the number of the Russian social networks is increasing. And it's interesting that even those who in their real life speak Romanian, they nevertheless watch Russian social networks. And that is what my Moldovan friends tell me. And they get most of the information from Russian networks. Well, I can say that Telegram, among messengers, has the first place only in Moldova, Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine. And as for the rest of the country, they use WhatsApp and the other messengers. Well, Telegram still has a share. Even in Germany, it is increasing, and it is used by both left-wing and right-wing. But nevertheless, it is the situation which our Moldovan friends observe, and therefore, for the Russian Federation, Moldova issue is critical, and they understand that they should raise their stakes regarding Moldova. I think they also understood that they are going to lose these elections. The leadership of Moldova, in my opinion, acted quite reasonably, and in some cases even decisively. But the economy in the country is not an easy one, and lots of things depend on it. Russian influence does not disappear anywhere, and I think that in the Russian elites there is reconsideration of these strategies with a certain perspective, and the change of the priorities. And I'm talking not only about Cossack, but I'm talking about other perspectives. So saying that there are no concerns regarding Moldova, I can say that it's too early to say that. And speaking of negotiations, I believe that we should go together and simultaneously. If we separate these negotiations, then there will be internal tension, because for some of the countries, not only for Romania, Moldova's promotion is important. Even if there was a change of position, even if they would have become more pro-Russian, yes, even despite that, absolutely. Moldova is quite often considered in the context of the Balkans, and Moldovan representatives sometimes even speculate about this matter, and they do it quite professionally. They clearly understand that for Moldova's promotion, they do not need some big money like it is in our case. Most of Moldovans, they integrated into the European Union. How they are going to have an influence on the domestic policy politics of Moldova. I do not want to make parallels between Moldova and Romanians, but probably you know that majority of Romanian diaspora was voting for the right-wing candidate for presidential elections, and that is a very important, very emotional question, because the majority of those Romanians who reside in the European Union accuses Romanian leadership in neglect and ineffective promotion of Romania forward, and Romania that Romania is not moving forward. Yes, absolutely. So if you consider the situation in the countries, you can see that 90% of those who voted abroad, they voted for the right-wing candidate on the last presidential elections, not 60 but 90. Let me clarify. So we are talking about Moldova. Yes, but we made a breach to Romania. So I'm saying that I do not want to make any parallels because many in Moldova are quite allergic to such comparisons. But nevertheless, in Moldova, those who work abroad, in fact, they are supporting the economy because the money they send is in fact macroeconomic balance of Moldova. Some of them work in the European Union, some of them work in the Russian Federation. We also know that many work first in the EU and then in the Russian Federation. And I think that Russian intelligence services are using it accordingly, and Europe also knows about it, and therefore I can say that we still have to be careful with Moldova. Second, it is very important for us to move together, not to create the internal stress, tension, and of course there will be the ones who will be willing us to create such tension. And third, the better we coordinate our line inside these logics of the process, so the more effectively we can move forward. And I think that in Moldova there will be the ones who will be willing to coordinate this line together with Balkan countries. I can feel it even on the individual level. I agree with you. We have to, you remember, we had the position that it is better to go together, and then Moldova, as a small country which can implement reforms faster, it went ahead. Ukraine, well, small ones do not make reforms faster. The thing is that you can do them cheaper, but cheaper is not always faster. Okay, Moldova showed more progress. And we have to say that not only Moldova, but also Georgia, and then Ukraine. And then there were the arguments like Ukraine is still at war, it's difficult, no negotiations. And then Hungary stopped blocking, let's wait for the elections. And therefore, from different discussions, I understood that in Moldova they actually have the same issues. In Moldova they have Transnistria, they have the divisions, the units of the Russian army, there are the further risk which you've mentioned that the situation is still not over. In Europe no one is talking about the risk due to Moldova entering the European Union, that maybe the Russian Federation will be operating on the borders very aggressively, and for some reason Moldova is forgotten, and Ukraine is facing this issue. So the Russian Federation can be attacking Ukraine, and Ukraine can be attacked when being the part of the European Union. So if we go together with Moldova, in this case, it's kind of not a big issue, and therefore maybe there can be the package for three: Ukraine, Moldova, Bosnia and Herzegovina. Well, with Moldova the situation is a bit different, because in the European Union there is such a temptation to consider Moldova like Cyprus, and to separate some certain territory, in this case Transnistria, in some special, to give it some special status, in order for this status to be stable. For many European politicians, we are the country at war with a nuclear state, and therefore how can we approach can we enter the pre-membership stage? Of course, there is legislation alignment and many other things, but politically, even despite sincere declaration, desires to move fast, understanding of it and the strategies on how it is going to be implemented is not in place. And that is something we have to understand, and that is something we have to help the European Union to come up with, because both we and Bosnia, and in fact Moldova, even though with Moldova I think the situation is a bit simpler, we do not fit into standard templates. So you cannot just take this endless instruction, quasi democratic, and you can move faster, you can move slower, but nevertheless you endlessly demonstrate the progress or lack of progress, then you're criticized or praised, and it is an endless story. So it is not beneficial neither for us nor for Bosnia, and I'm not even saying that there is such a big ghost around Serbia, very complicated. It doesn't work for all of us, and we were talking about emotions. And I think that we have to visualize, partially with arguments, partially emotionally, to explain it to those who the change of the strategy depend on. And I'm absolutely sure that despite all of these formal movements and statements we hear from Kremlin about not only NATO and the EU, seems like let them go to the EU, and both of us remember 2013 and European flag here in Ukraine, our progress and Moldova's progress is also the threat for the Russian Federation, for the nowadays leadership and therefore there will be an attempt to disrupt our European integration in all possible ways and even impossible ways. And doing it in the ways how we did it a long time ago, in my opinion, is a way to the new problems in the future. Moreover, we were talking about our neighbors. And in fact, we do not have ordinary neighbors. Each of them is special in their own way. And since we will have negotiations in unique situation, that is also the issue of the strategic planning. And not just for some future, but for tomorrow. And therefore, things we can do right now and which are critical for our survival right now is one thing, but continuation of this in the future, and considering the fact that we will have to change the patterns on the membership of the European Union, unfortunately only a limited number of European politicians share the same opinion. Well, it's quite clear that of course the situation is quite complicated, and on the one hand war makes it even more difficult, but on the other hand war and Putin pushed Ukraine quite seriously, quite well, to the no alternative decision. And in this regard I have only one, so to say, fear. It might be strange, but I do not want it to happen. When we met all the requirements, and sometimes they are very strict, very tough, and then we finally do not join the European Union. We didn't get access to the funds and we got nothing. Well, I think it will not happen in this way, but nevertheless we can hear the statements of the European countries, so that it will be very difficult to have it by 2030. And therefore I have a small remark. I can see that Ukrainian government at the moment is quite, well, so to say, skeptical about the moods of Ukraine, that people's opinion can change for the worse, but at the same time we can see that Euro-skepticism can increase in Ukraine. And considering this background, I can tell you that we cannot be decreasing the lobbying or informing about the difficulties and advantages of these steps. And recently there was the decision to redistribute budget, relocate budget funds so they took it from the Euro-Atlantic integration program, and they took just 4 billion. And where did they take it? Gas it. And now these money are allocated for the marathon, the central marathon, informational marathon, or it's a single marathon, and through it to the companies which earn money on that for several years. And I'm surprised with it, because public sector, on the contrary, Ukraine Crisis Media Center, for example, we are trying to get some support, some funding in terms of clarifying of complex issues, in fact. Because one of the questions, why the former ambassador Tsekhovsky in Poland, he raised this question. He says, Ukrainian citizens in Poland, Ukrainian citizens on their cars, they do not have the maintenance because they are refugees, they have temporary displaced people, and at the same time Poles have to go through this maintenance check every year, and we have to be explaining to the Ukrainian that technical maintenance is something really necessary, because at some point it was a very corrupted scheme, and therefore we have to be explaining that, for example, the replacement of licenses, and we were discussing with the Ministry of Internal Affairs, and I was asking whether you're communicating these things. He said yes, but it's not that important. But in fact, people are confirming that at the moment it is really important, and I can summarize that we should not be forgetting about these priorities, that we have to be lobbying, we have to be informing people, because negotiations, well, okay, we had screening. Let's hope that all the blocks will be over, but nevertheless, there might be the situation when, at some point, the number of Eurosceptics will increase significantly in Ukraine on the last stage. By the way, that is this. And by the way, Israel, it turned out, provided Ukraine with Patriot systems. So, I have a question. Considering this. All this situation, we need lots of money, and we're talking not even about hryvnias, even though basically the army gets the budgets in hryvnia, but the supplies of weapons is procured from the European Union. That is the only way we are left with. So the Europeans, they are, by the way, they are buying, not only the European Union is buying, because for some reason we are emphasizing the European Union, but also we have the UK, not only the European Union. And let's not forget about Norwegians, the Republic of Turkey, the Swiss, but there is another situation. So I have a question. So we are left with one option to purchase. And then we have the statements, Ukrainian official statements, that we are talking about some big deal, 100 billion deal. And I do not know, to frankly speaking, the situation. And not only I do not understand what it is about, but only the stages of implementation. And it seems to be that the US agreed, the Americans decided to buy 50 billion deal for drones. And now the statement of Volodymyr Zelensky that we can be selling weapons, as he said, in a controlled manner. I do not understand what does he mean by a controlled manner, but of course everything is regulated in the world, and we have the right we have the export control. We maybe he meant controlled in order to preserve the immediate needs, the important needs of the army, and to sell something else. And in this context, I have a question. So I remember, and we have the criminal proceedings ongoing against the ministers of defense when they were selling the weapons. They also consider that we have plenty of it, unnecessary weapons. And so there is a question whether there will be the question to Minister of Defense Shmyhal or to anyone else when we will be selling armament. But what about the perception? Like, what do you think about it? What do you know about it? And in the same way, maybe it would have been even better to use the agreement on rare minerals, and there should have been a kind of exchange of weapons to minerals. Well, the position of the American administration is that Europeans have to take all the responsibility for security support for Ukraine. Possible fundamental exceptions, it applies to the sectors where Europeans will not be able tomorrow or the day after tomorrow provide us with all the important things, for example, intelligence or, for example, armament, which the European Union does not produce. As of now, no European companies don't produce missile defense systems which are effective. Well, all the systems which are produced nowadays that are the defense system with limited ability to shoot down missiles of various types. So now European countries are actively procuring the new American ones or American-Israeli system, for example, Arrow, which are closing this gap. So for a long time, we will depend from the Americans in areas which are important for us. Europeans will not take this role. There is an assessment. In some way, it is controversial, and it says that Europeans will have to invest at least 1 trillion of euros during the next 10 years to cover even the main gaps. With the new investments, if they will bring not maybe even to 5 but 3.5%, well, it might be possible, even though it is very problematic. Second, a significant part of fan club, and I'm not saying this in not disrespecting tone, but in a real one, they do not want the American administration to finance someone. Support, yes. Funding, no. This is the dominant sentiment among those who supports both Donald Trump and the current administration. And I believe that he will continue seeing foreign policy through the lens of, first of all, his understanding, and second of all, through the lens of the domestic politics. And for him, there are those who support him. So it will not change tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. Well, everything is clear here. So for quite a few times we're discussing it, that Americans will continue this line. I have a question, not about the US, but about Ukraine. 50 billion for drones. What is that, and what can we sell which is worth 50 billion, especially if we're talking about the US? And the second question, whether during the war and unpredictable situation we can be selling weapons. Well, the specialists in this sector, they say yes, I know their position, but at the same time, should we secure ourselves, or maybe we have to make this difficult decision, and maybe that can be some kind of sad solution, not just selling the technology. So we sell it to the US, especially like when we're talking about 50 billion. 50 billion, Americans will not pay that because they have their own. The Europeans do not want to pay the money for the American weapons. You said it very correctly, they do not have the relevant weapons, but if the Europeans had the relevant weapon, they would have bought it from the EU. And therefore I have the question. So I can see that these 50 million, they are taken from the thin air, because Americans might need technology, maybe some samples, but for procuring it from Ukraine, why? Donald Trump is not the kind of person which will give the money somewhere outside. And here I have a simple question. The first question is the context of weapons and war, and the second, well, is this something real? Can we somehow understand whether it will be implemented or not, or is it just kind of our general numbers, 100 billion, 50 billion? I cannot comment on 50 billion. 50 billion is is a big amount, even for high-tech weapons. This is something that can be not implemented in 2, even 4 years. So if we are talking about these amounts, these are the programs of even not medium but long-term cooperation. The second thing I know from the Americans, they are interested in procurement of not only experience and some certain technologies, but indeed they are interested in hardware. And it's due to the fact that the new concept mean that on the battlefield a significant amount of weapons will be used, and not only of high tech but also the one which works together with high tech technologies. For example, platforms for different drones, possibility of using large quantity of them based on the linkage of them into a single system according to the logics of a single strategist. And of course, some of American companies, especially those which are currently have the orders of from Pentagon, they are not interested in producing, let's say, drones, or I'm not going to say what else, but the other things, where the number is even so. Our niche of Ukraine is drones and not missiles. Well, I'm not going to say anything about missiles. So our niche is FPV drones, and are we sent to this niche? Well, FPV drones is the matter of today. It's not the matter of tomorrow. Tomorrow, the majority of drones will be guided by artificial intelligence. And it's already there. And since 2026, even simple drones, they are going to be driven by AI. In fact, we have our own interesting niches. And these interesting niches, they are both drone related and not drone related. Whether we will be selling missiles to the Americans, well, I don't know. No, I'm not speaking about selling missiles. I mean that we had the expectations why I was talking about offsets and the other things, because sooner or later we will need only to produce our own missiles. We will have not only to produce some platforms with rain metal or BMP vehicles, APC vehicles. We need to get on, maybe not American, maybe not if European, then it can be European military-industrial complex. It seems to me that they just want to take the tested systems tested during the war, and that is a unique experience. And after the war, this big statement that Ukraine will become the weapons manufacturer, that it's going to be one of the fundamentals of the economy, they somehow disappear. And localization is happening more and more in Europe, also for the leading projects. For example, it's not a secret. We are helping, and when I'm ordering some specific things for the guys on the front line, for example, we had the production in Ukraine, and then for some reason it is already in Germany, and you have to bring it from Germany. And we were told that it will be very beneficial for Ukraine, and that is a specific thing. So the person just moved to Germany and works in Germany right now. So that is a component, small component. So this is a separate issue. We moving next. But what I can see now, well, I have a question: why Americans have to pay as well? You said hardware, it's good, but let me remind you 2018 when we broke through this embargo wall together, and what we were supplied, which was called drones, so it was more advanced, frankly speaking, than what we had 2 years ago. And now we have better situation, but Americans until now, they still have lots of possibilities. In every university, they even have a program. They are giving money for the intellectual programs. They are developing drones, and it's not a problem for them to to go even further than we are now. The only argument which really works in this case is the market distribution, because it has less profit. I mean, here you're absolutely right, and that gave me the idea. Aren't they sending us to the niche when they will restore the metal production in order for us to make metal chemistry? And here we have a minimum technology, and that's it. Well, I can tell you from my personal experience and what I'm doing with. Well, that is a market, the arms market, a market of dual-use products. On this market, it is very difficult to build extra class production and the possibility to maintain them around the world. So I believe that our best opportunities in the future is in the partnership with those with whom it is beneficial for us and with whom we can work reliably. That is, first of all, European American companies, but not only them. They see for us some opportunities in these partnerships, and if we will not use these partnerships, that is my personal opinion, we will lose the vast majority of our best specialists. And we will lose in the future technological leadership, and we will not be able to provide even for ourselves with the weapon that is critically important for us from the containment perspective. I also can see that the representatives of many Western companies really consider these partnerships as a long-term partnerships, and it's obvious that we cannot be doing everything within these partnerships. But considering the fact that the arms market is drastically changing, we have some interesting niches there, and it doesn't mean that we will be able to do everything, or otherwise we will be pushed out from the to the segment with the minimal margin, because without modern technologies, the hardware doesn't work. And as for the economical model for Ukraine and economical order in Ukraine, I do not see any kind of big chemistry and big metal in Ukraine. I think that our economy will be service-based economy with agri-tech. Nothing else here, nothing else we will be able to earn money on. Mr. Pavlo, I'm smiling because I guess we haven't looked at the documents in a long time. The government is stating exactly this position: metallurgical enterprises, chemistry, and restoration of the agroeconomic structures. But it doesn't mean that we have to be promoting this idea. Yes, it does mean, and it's good that you said it, and I will tell it to our viewers. And now we are restoring Ukraine, and that is restoring Ukraine just to restore all those businesses, all the ones which belong to big business, first of all, and in addition to that, agriculture, and of course the military industrial complex, and of course we're talking about high technologies. If you take any kind of document, you know what was in the last document presented externally at a conference in Rome. Well, the first position was the purchase of nuclear reactors, that infamous Energoatom pushed to this crap there again, that we have to buy it from Bulgaria. So that is the position, and therefore I'm urging those who are in charge of it to hear that the war gave us the opportunity, and your integration gave this chance to change a situation. And when we will have no 50 million, but instead we'll have 25, as Ms. Libanova says, and I see more or less the same situation. The economy structure has to be different, but that is a big topic, and I wish we. In fact, there are two questions. One of them is brief but difficult, but the second one is long but simple. And the short one is that Donald Trump recently started to say that America's strength is in nuclear strategic component. So, once again, this topic is raised by him. He called stupid the statements of the deputy head of the Russian Federation, and he said and his statements about nuclear weapon. But at the same time, he did not continue. Though public information is that Pentagon is now checking the ability of enterprises and companies to produce missiles and missile carriers. And they are going to increase the production, different types of missiles. And on the 5th of February 2026, the only treaty on the number of nuclear weapons is over, START 3. And here we have an interesting situation. Russia already understands that they might start the wrong way of competition, and we've already observed such a situation when the Soviet Union collapsed, and what was the situation like. But they not just ask, but they declare that they are ready to perform this contract, even if it will not be continuing the next year. Yes, but only 1 year. So here we have a question, very simple one. Donald Trump, when he arrived immediately as this 45th president, he said, we are leaving START 3 and we are scaling up of the minimum 3 missiles. And the Russian Federation was very concerned about that. And now the Russian Federation was boasting that they were showing their Oрешnik, even though it's a mid-range missile. So they raised this issue of the missile carriers. And then suddenly Americans start playing this game as well. So what do you think? Who is it more beneficial for? Not to continue the contract, the treaty, START 3, and whether the Russian Federation will stand if America will now begin to further develop its missile program. Well, America develops it, and this program is not just about missiles, it is about modernization of the entire nuclear component of the nuclear triad. It costs a lot of money. It is carried out during all administrations. It is one of a few rare consensus in the current American realities. And I do think that the implementation of this program suffered under the first presidency of Trump or Biden's presidency. That is sustainable financing, and it includes all the components of nuclear triad, and it includes nuclear weapons accordingly. Second, Americans don't see this START 3 treaty as bilateral agreement, as Moscow would have liked to see it. They have a global consideration of this matter, considering how nuclear component is developing in China and how global balances are built, or better to say disbalances, imbalances. Of course, they would have liked the negotiations to have the global scale, and China doesn't want to do that. Yes, China wants to increase significantly the number of nuclear warheads by the end of this decade and beyond. They have the plans, and these plans are quite ambitious, and the logic of China is that we can start thinking about these negotiations if the number of nuclear weapons in China compared to the United States and Russia. Third, no matter how much we talk about nuclear blackmail from Russia, for current American administration, previous reality, which is post reality of the Cold War and which was dominating Biden's administration, is over. Look, Putin comes with his statement about Oрешnik. The public reaction is almost zero. Then Putin comes again with the statement that even after the expiration date of the treaty, on control over strategic weapons, we will be there for another year and no public reaction. Well, in this case, it's quite clear. And then the generals are gathering, and Trump is speaking with a keynote speech, which everyone heard, and which there is no sense to break it down into the separate paragraphs. And that means that today, in Trump's head, as far as I understand it, and in the minds of those who advise him on this matter, the understanding of the risks and what should be done around these risks is absolutely different. And in nuclear sphere, these mottos or mantras, peace through strength, is all in the field of strategic weapons. In the field of strategic weapons, and carriers, and as far as I understand, in space sector, well, it is quite consistently implemented. Well, you perfectly know balance of Pentagon budgets. Well, it's a record budget, trillion. It's a significant money, even considering the American peculiarities. And if the Europeans will allocate more funds, and if the partnership with Asian companies will meet, and then some technologies and money, we will have unique situation. And therefore, my answer is that Trump will continue to promote development and modernization of nuclear components in America. At some point, non-public negotiations will start with Europeans about what and how should be done in order to preserve or maybe even to strengthen the support of the United States. In Moscow, everyone knows about it. And in Moscow, they also do understand that all the signals they sent, they are not working in the current administration, as well as it did not work in the previous administration. And that is a new type of interaction between Washington and Moscow regarding nuclear weapons. So the status quo which existed before, in my opinion, will not exist anymore. Well, I can add that big money is not in the NDA, but in the Ministry of Energy. That is the part. Well, where technologies are developed. Yes, missile, the first ballistic missile is there. On the first floor, it is demonstrated there. And it's quite clear. Well, I went through the budget and I can see that, well, you're right, but I can say that during Barack Obama, some things, they were less financed. For example, Ohio-class submarines. Now, this is a serious issue, and every year there is a very large sum, several billions of dollars. And another nuance, there is a factory in the territory where Republicans are winning. Well, if you don't mind, I will interrupt you. I was talking about Biden because Obama's policies in some sectors, both when it comes to armaments and disarmament, I just do not support it. I just do not understand it. Well, I think that conclusion will be made later, but the fact that Americans have advantages in this dialogue of the nuclear weapons conversation, I think the options, they have more options than the Russian who are limited in funding. Maybe they will implement their ambitious program, which is worth 1,200 million, but they have very big gaps when it comes both to launching ballistic missiles, and it's constantly repeated again and again. We know that they are exploding in the mines, and sometimes they cannot launch it. So if the Americans, Donald Trump, would have made a step and said that Americans are ready to build up and to show their strengths, I think that Russia would have cooled down. But let's see what will happen next. There is another aspect we were discussing the previous time, as far as I understand. If the Golden Dome will be at least partially implemented, it will lead to the fact that the START treaty will be impossible. START treaty will be impossible. It's not something where you can change some numbers, some lines and paragraphs. It's an absolutely different situation. It means that the logics of the missile defense, whatever it is, with all its space components, it is changing the logics of the control of a strategic offensive weapons and their balance. And even if Trump will be able to implement it in a limited way in the beginning, nevertheless, it's absolutely new reality. And Europe in this new reality, and we were discussing that, Europe is not managing to get close into this reality. Europe is not catching up, and that is a fundamental problem. And therefore, the fact that Trump is throwing and making a pressure on Europe is, in my opinion, is helping us. And therefore, the preliminary logics, the previous logics of the escalation, in my opinion, considering the new ideas and the new projects and new modernization, it will not come back. It is impossible to rewrite it. Yes, that's true. And sooner or later, Beijing will become the part of this process. India yesterday launched Agni 3 missile, 2,000 kilometers range, and I think that most likely there will be the competition in the field of strategic weapons, starting with space, and then ballistic missile carriers of different types, maybe now with some new options, but the fact that there will be less control, well, treaties do not work. I guess nothing is working nowadays, and even those which were written on the paper, they were preached, like the treaty on the middle and long-range missiles. A similar situation was in Slovakia, and even in Poland there was a very similar situation. The decrease of number of the optimists, even though Poland was very strong in this case, but that is a separate discussion. But it's not 4 million, but even 40 million will not help you. If you want to do that, it has to be very systematic and not from the perspective of some positive lullaby and saying that whatever will happen on the way to the European Union, it is going to be very positive. Everyone is going to smile. Everything is going to be fine. In my opinion, what we have to be saying about the European Union, considering the fact that unfortunately millions of people, millions of Ukrainians are in the European Union in different statuses, it is the question for us: how will we understand what we want in this transitional period? Because at the moment, very unpleasant and very concerning trends are discussed. The new members of the European Union, they have to have some sort of, they will get some kind of have membership status, so they have to fulfill all the necessary requirements, and at the same time they are not getting all the benefits from the European Union. Well, something like, let's stop in the middle for those who are not able to move forward. And in this way, fragmentation of the European Union and Europe will start, and that is very dangerous. But speaking of the European Union, I think we should not be doing what is called advocacy. I think we have to be explaining how we have to change our lives, and we have to do that in order to become a member of the European Union. The maintenance example is a very good example, but unfortunately we have not even dozens, but thousands, literally thousands of them. I remember it back from the time when we had the agreement on association, and agreement on association is just 1/12, and maybe even not 12, but even less, what we will have now in our agenda. And I think that we have to be talking not about positives and negatives, but we have to consider the reality and how can we become better for ourselves and not for the European Union. And that is a very difficult conversation. And for that, we need Europeans who would have worked with us directly. And by the way, they are willing to do so, but at the same time, they do not know how to do that. And I'm telling them that this is the right time to do that, and they say no, let's wait, and then maybe the war will be over and then we'll move further. Well, I want to say that 4 million is very small amount for the front, and for the informational work with efficient application in non-governmental sector, and not just stupid stealing, which can be confirmed and was confirmed in previous years, because theft or inefficient usage is very simple. When one company very close to the government gets 60 million hryvnias for a culinary show, well, it was professionally made, high quality. Well, I don't like making such a show. You can do it. But, where did they take this money from? They took it from the program which we supported very actively, the Ministry of the Foreign Affairs program. They took the money from the institute, the one which you established. Yes, the Crimean Institute, 20 million. And they relocated these months there, and they gave it 57 million. So 57 million hryvnias for 4 months. Okay, then I have a suggestion, an offer. And of course, there is a part of a joke in every joke. We can make European cooking show. Yeah, we already have such specialists. If I think it will take us a long way if we start with culinary shows, but with the cooking shows. But still, there are some things which can be more efficient, cheaper. Well, my opinion is that the period when the public diplomacy was showing cooking shows is over. There are the other ways to lobby Ukraine, and here we are talking about the sectors where the money is absolutely, the number is absolutely different. Today is the 1st of October, and all the Ukrainian funding programs are over. Not because it's of the decision, but the budget here is over yesterday. For them, the bad news is that plus, in addition, shutdown from today, but, they will overcome this shutdown. And I think they already had such a situation, and I think it lasted more than 3 weeks during the first presidency. Well, they were able to resolve that question, and I think they will resolve this one as well. But what is important for us? The money that was determined by Congress for two sources, USAI and PDA, they are still remaining there, a few billions of dollars, and from today you cannot be using that. There are no other solutions, packages, anything. 400 million in total is in the budget, and $400 million is nothing. What is 400 million? That is even not half of a Patriot battery. Well, I guess it's precisely half of it. Well, I think the prices went up considering the efficient use. By the way, we have to thank the Germans. They publicly stated that 2 systems will be transferred to Ukraine. And who is financing that? The region supported it.